Who knows? Maybe it is just for this moment that you find yourself in a position of leadership. I'm Rabbi Liz Hirsch, and I'm your host. Inspired by the story of Esther, I will invite women in leadership to talk about women and leadership. As CEO of Women of Reform Judaism, the women's affiliate of the largest Jewish denomination in North America, I am committed to sharing powerful stories of women who stand out in their fields, who have stepped up just for this moment. Each week, I interview women who are influencing the world around them. My guest today is Leah Donnella. What does it mean to belong? And what do we even mean when we say belonging? Leah Donnella is an editor on NPR's Code Switch team, a podcast, blog, and newsletter that explores race and how it shapes every part of society. The name Code Switch comes from a term coined in the mid-20th century describing the work people from marginalized identities often have to do to adapt to the social or cultural expectations of the majority. In 2016, Leah published a powerful article for NPR titled Black, Jewish, and Avoiding the Synagogue on Yom Kippur. In it, she describes being treated like an outsider while shul shopping simply because of her race. She writes, "There's something about feeling like an outsider in the place where you grew up. It stings. Like family members who no longer recognize you." Nearly 10 years later, many Jews of color are still code switching in predominantly white Jewish spaces and still being made to feel like outsiders. May this conversation remind us that the work of justice must also begin within our own communities, by confronting and dismantling racism where we live and where we pray.
I'm a journalist at NPR, National Public Radio, and I work on the Code Switch team. So it's a podcast and radio show that tells stories about race and identity and culture and the ways that all of those things intersect with politics and pop culture and all different areas of our social and personal lives.
Wonderful. You are talking to a total public radio nerd. So I'm familiar with Code Switch, familiar with, of course, the important work that NPR does. But I would love it if you could just get a little bit more into what the show is like, the topics that you tackle, and then we definitely want to hear more about your own personal story as well, too.
Absolutely. So the show started actually about 10 years ago now. We launched as a podcast in 2016 toward the end of President Obama's second term. When Obama was first elected, there was a lot of discussion of we are now in a post-racial United States. It quickly became apparent that that was not true. And so our show was sort of launched to look at all of the ways that race and racism and race relations had changed in the years since essentially the civil rights movement, but that those things were still very central to our lives and our politics and our culture. So that's kind of where it came out of. And we talked about what does white culture look like in the Trump era. We talked about what will the legacy of President Obama's presidency be? What will that mean for representation and representation politics? But we also talked a lot about like love and relationships and TV shows and music and all the kind of things that make our lives so rich and diverse. And there was always stuff happening in the news. So we still have a kind of balance of following what's going on in the news and then looking at the more kind of personal and cultural elements in people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that when your team set out with the concept for the show, you obviously had no idea. You didn't have a crystal ball about what was coming and what was going to happen. And I felt totally similarly setting up a podcast that focused on women in leadership and their connection into the story of Esther right prior to the events of October 7th, the current events that went on in the news. But to have the container for a conversation that has sort of at its core these big ideas, and then looking at all the many facets and the sides of the concept gives you sort of the touch point and the connection with listeners, and also with folks who are going to come on and share their thoughts.
Oh, absolutely.
Could you tell us a little bit about your path? How did you get here, and folks that influenced you along the way?
I never grew up thinking about being a journalist or planning this career path exactly. But I grew up, so my mom is a white Ashkenazi Jew. My dad is a Black Catholic man. And so race and religion and identity were always constant subjects of conversation in my house growing up. There was a lot of negotiation about what we believed, where we lived, who we were in community with, and what that looked like. And just both of my parents are also lawyers, so there was, maybe for that reason, just a lot of discussion in minute detail about everything. So that was something that I was very used to and interested in. I loved thinking about how identity shapes people's lives and how we kind of draw certain guardrails again, like around some identities, what makes those boundaries real and what is fake about them and what we believe about them, and then how they morph if you go into different spaces. Yeah, so those are things I had always kind of been thinking about and talking about. And then when I got to college, I wound up majoring in Africana Studies, which was just kind of another way to think about how we create identities, what goes into that, what are the assumptions we make about certain identities, and what are the kind of true and false pieces of them. After college, I was kind of bouncing around doing different things and exploring different things, and I learned about Code Switch, which at the time was just a little emerging blog and radio show, and kind of starting to explore these ideas. And I was like, that's awesome. I really want to be a part of that. So I applied to an internship, and that's kind of how I wound up there and have been reporting on race and identity ever since.
Wonderful. I definitely want to ask you about the powerful essay you wrote several years ago at this point about your experience on the High Holy Days, your experiences, coming into synagogue, temple, Jewish spaces, and just get your reflections on it. And I know that since the piece is a little ways on and we're talking now, here for folks who may or may not have read the piece, we'll share out the link when we share this episode, this conversation, to see if your thoughts have evolved or changed.
I think they have changed a lot in the time since I wrote that. But yeah, to give a little bit of the background, I wrote this piece that was around the time of the High Holy Days, I think maybe in 2017 or so. At the time, I was becoming sort of increasingly anxious about going to synagogue on that time, because I had had some recent experiences of just being in different Jewish spaces and different synagogues where I felt that as a Black woman, I was kind of assumed to be an outsider, assumed that I was either there because I was with other people, or that I wouldn't understand what was going on, or, that sort of thing. So there was a lot of kindness, but a lot of just like people coming over and trying to explain to me what was happening. And it was a very alienating sort of feeling. So the essay was kind of thinking about what it felt like at that time to have this feeling of being a perpetual outsider in a space that I felt very much a part of and very connected to, but how that had also inadvertently separated me from the spaces, right? So part of why people thought of me as an outsider is because I didn't have a community that I belonged to, and I didn't have people that I was in regular contact with regular spaces with, in a kind of sort of organized Jewish community. It was thinking about the dynamic between other people making me feel like an outsider, but also my own actions having caused me to be an outsider as well. And then thinking about what it would look like for that to change.
I definitely want to talk more about the piece about sort of the way in which the members of that community approached you, right? It's the frame of, we're so welcoming, we're so inclusive, we're so glad to have you here, but they othered you. They made you feel actually like an outsider by speaking from that place of assumption that you were someone who was stepping into a synagogue for the first time, when really you had grown up in a synagogue, had that, rich Jewish background and community, and knew what was what. And I have seen that, observed that before stepping into the role of CEO of Women of Reform Judaism, the North American organization that I lead. I was a congregational rabbi. I watched this happen and interacted with folks over conversations around this when a person of color would come to the door of our congregation on a Friday night, and everyone was very excited to be welcoming, but also automatically had the assumption that these folks saw that the members of the community, it didn't compute, right? That like this could be someone who has their own Jewish background, own Jewish identity. And I experienced that and spoke with folks afterwards who this happened to them is very painful. So I'm really sorry that you had that experience.
Thank you. Yeah. And it was interesting because it was something that I had seen happen to my dad a lot growing up. He, as I mentioned before, he's Catholic, but he spent a lot of time in synagogues with us. He had been married to a Jewish woman for decades. And he had also grown up around a lot of Jews and was very familiar with Judaism. Watching him very regularly have things explained to him that he knew very deeply and had grappled with very deeply, that was a painful experience. And then to have it happen to me as an adult just felt like, how long is this going to last? How many generations will this be the case for? And now being a parent, it's something that I think about for what that will look like in the future.
Right, because there's the layers of experience over the course of, now it will be for just your own family, but for other families, multiple generations. And there's also the layer of, you do identify as Jewish and connected to the Jewish community, but even for someone who is in a proud, engaged, interfaith family who personally doesn't identify as Jewish, then what are the different layers of experience and how those are similar to each other, but also distinct in the experiences that you had?
I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about more recently, in the years since that essay was first published, was what would it mean for me to be enough a part of different Jewish communities and integrated enough that people know me because I'm there every week, or people know me because I'm a regular presence. And so they don't have to pull out the welcome wagon or whatever it is. That's been interesting to think about, because I think it's easy when you blend into a certain space. I think it's easy to take for granted that you can just come in and out as you choose, and that will always be a part of your identity. That's just like, you can decide when to opt in and when to opt out. But I think when you're not in that space, you have to show up in a different way, and make your sort of presence and belonging more regular and obvious, which in some ways is a burden, but I think in some ways is also a tremendous gift because it forces you to think about what you actually care about and why it matters to be part of community, and not just like able to dip your toes in community. So it's work, but I think it's also a sort of privileged work.
Right. It's extra work, as you've been describing, because of the assumptions that come along with showing up. But I always encourage folks to, do show up, right? And then we get into relationship, then we get into community, then it's moving beyond welcoming or including, even though those, there are fraught aspects there as well too, to how can we really be in conversation and community with each other.
Yeah, exactly.
You've spoken a little bit about your parents. I'm wondering if there's anyone else who you connect with as a role model, whether from the Jewish community or from other spaces that guided you along the way and the journey that you described.
The person who immediately comes to mind was both my childhood rabbi and childhood cantor were so formative for me in thinking about what it means to be Jewish, what it means to me. My rabbi, a man named Peter Hyman, was and is an extraordinary person because he was so excellent at making Jewish texts feel extremely relevant each week to what was happening politically in the country. and helping us as a congregation think through why Judaism was very alive and very just like a tangible force in our lives and in our engagement with the world. I know there's a lot of debate and discussion in certain places about how directly political rabbis should be or want to be, but I thought it was so helpful that every week at Shabbat services, he would talk about what was happening in the news and what the sort of deep moral questions were that we were kind of being invited to engage with. And even as an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, like coming to understand that that was the role of faith, at least it would be for me, was engaging with the world in a very like specifically moral way. I don't know. It was a privilege. It was such a privilege. I know I've been using that word a lot, but it meant that I never felt like being Jewish was like one part of me and that engaging with the world was going to be this other part of me, and that realms, they all felt very integrated.
Yeah, that's just such a powerful sense of alignment that you're describing, of being able to integrate a lot of different ways that you move through the world. And I think about it in terms, you're saying, how much do rabbis, how much do clergy speak about issues of the day from the Bima to the congregation on Shabbat? And it's such a live question right now, but in some ways it's an age-old conversation, right? I root it in the tradition of the prophets of speaking up and the responsibility to speak truth to power and to do it through a Jewish lens. And, for millennia, we have lived in the world, right? And I think, as we look to talk about the Esther story a little bit, that's what I've found so powerful about the Purim story is it's a diaspora story. It's a story that could only happen when Esther, a Persian Jew, arguably a Jew of color, was, in this community where they were not the government, where they were not the rulers, and how to navigate that conversation. She got to a point where she had to speak up.
Yeah, that is a question that obviously resonates across the ages. And there is always this feeling among a lot of people of when is it safe to speak up? When is it not safe, but still important to speak up? And how do you do that in a way that's strategic? And how do you do that in a way that is true to your beliefs and all of that? I know different people answer that question in different ways. But I just often think about the fact that it's a luxury to have that choice, and choosing not to speak up or choosing to be able to separate those questions, I think, with people, with oppressed people. And that means like not having the choice to be silent and not having the choice to, not accepting the choice to opt out of important discussions that are very urgent for people in the world.
Right. And you said you've been using the word privilege a lot. It completely applies in this type of circumstance. Looking at Esther, right? She was in the most privileged position that not only a Jewish person in Persia, but that any woman could be in, to be at the level of queen. And she still, when she took action to speak up to the king and say what Haman was planning for the Jewish people, she did so at risk of her own life, right? So like, think about someone at the highest level of privilege, but all the restrictions that come along with her gender, with her faith, the people that she was, still connected in with, even though she had been hiding that identity. And she still hits the limit. She still hits the wall.
Yeah. And I think that idea too, of linked fate, which is obviously so powerful in so many different, across so many different groups. But I think for her, there's this idea of like your privilege and your position doesn't mean anything if the people that you care about and the people that you are connected to will never have access to that and don't have those same things. And so at that point, it's like, what's the point of all of it? What's the point of having that access to power and that privilege if it's going to completely isolate you?
Wow. Yeah, that's a really and this is why I love that now we're on to the, 5th season of this show. Like we just always get around to a different angle of not just the Purim story, but of Esther's experience because it's so rich and so relevant for us. I'm wondering if what we're kind of describing more in the story, in the abstract, is what about that is showing up for you in current events or maybe in your own experience?
I'll start with my own experience. I, like so many people, have had the feeling in the past few years that like the world is kind of on fire and we are being thrown from disaster to disaster to disaster. And it's very overwhelming and very kind of, it can be kind of numbing to take it all in. I had a kid, my son, just over a year ago, and I'm also expecting another kid in May. And so I've had this very sort of protected domestic time and felt like in certain ways I have the chance to be in a bit of a bubble. I think a really easy way to feel when you're like playing with a 1-year-old and the sort of breadth of your thoughts is like, how do I get from like snack time to singing row, row, row your boat? It's like, it's so easy to just feel like this is the entire world. And then I also have just like the fact that I am lucky to live somewhere safe and to, if I want to, really not engage with certain things. While at the same time, I live in Los Angeles, a place where so many people in this city are fearful that they're going to be like disappeared and deported. So many people are experiencing homelessness. There is so much inequality in this city, and so many things going on just even in my like immediate neighborhood, not to even think about the entire country and everything going on. For me, thinking about like in what ways am I the person in that kind of protected tower who has the choice to either engage and speak out and kind of align myself with people who are in these really precarious and dangerous situations, and in what ways can I just like, do I want to, and am I tempted to just like shut my door and think about all of the like nice things going on in my own personal life in my home. And I think thinking about the story of Esther and the story of Purim is a helpful way to, it's just a helpful reminder of how false that sense of safety and separation can be.
Yeah. I really resonate with a lot of what you shared. I'm also a mom, a parent to two younger kids, a little bit older than yours. And I think that there's this inclination and the conversations that the way that I've been responding to folks, the opening of how are you or vice versa, it's I'm great and the world is, is the world. And what are the ways, what are the times, and this is how we can start to think about this to bridge it, right? Of to totally not be in the one pole of the bubble, but not to negate those things as valid and good and even sustaining. And then there's the world, and how can you integrate those pieces, or does it need to be the very small circle and the world of privilege and safety, and then everything else that's going on? How and when to step up and not just only use your voice, but with folks that I speak with and conversations that I'm having, especially with folks who are parents of young kids, but it's for anyone who may feel the pull of not just, using your voice, but using your presence and, putting your body out there, and what kind of decisions are folks making in those conversations and in those settings.
Which I think is where it gets even trickier, because I think the idea of, and this is something that comes up a lot in my work too, the idea of safety, I think is so compelling for people and can also be it can be manipulated in such interesting ways, because being safe is something that is kind of undefinable, and there are always different levels of what risk is and what safety is. And so I think there are endless arguments for why you should not do something, or why it's irresponsible to be somewhere or be engaged in something, or like put yourself physically in a certain phase. And it's just so easy to talk yourself and talk other people out of doing anything besides like staying at home. And so I think about that a lot, like how to sort of balance what I care about and what I'm willing to risk.
Exactly. Exactly that. I heard you offer a really thoughtful reflection on All Things Considered toward the end of last year about joy as resistance. It's so related to me for this conversation. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. And this is a topic that I've been really thinking about a lot too, in terms of resistance, sort of the spiritual angles of resistance. So I'd love to talk more about that and add that layer to this conversation.
But I kept hearing this refrain of people kind of using joy as an act of resistance. And so I wanted to know where that came from and what it looked like and what it looked like in practice for people. And I was really moved as I was doing that reporting, because I think I encountered so many people who were not using joy as an excuse to not do something, and not sort of saying that their joy was inherently an act of resistance, that like just the act alone of feeling happiness was doing something, but that they were braiding those things together. And they were saying that resisting joyfully was something that they were going to fight to do. I heard people talking about going to protests and dancing at protests, singing and dancing at protests. A woman told me a story of singing Motown music with her mom when her mom was in the hospital and was like experiencing a lot of bad treatment from different places. I heard from someone who was part of an organization where her role was to act as a temporary parental figure to people whose families had kicked them out when they found out that they were queer. And so just like bringing the joy of like getting a hug from mom, I'm doing air quotes, but that was the joyous resistance. And I think there were just so many ways that people described that were just felt really real and tangible to me, that even in my like kind of cynical and felt very real.
Well, and I'm sure there are ways that folks who might resonate with this idea of joy as resistance might find that joy completely on their own, but nearly everything that you just described and other scenarios that I can imagine, that joy as resistance piece is also relational. It's also communal. So it's like what we were speaking about choosing to opt into a community to get into relationship with folks and to have that be what sustains you in the tough work, but then also to have the benefit of, we're in this together, and that's what can sustain you as well too.
Yeah, and it reminds me of something that someone I interviewed said. Her name is Adrienne Marie Brown, and she's the author of a book called Pleasure Activism. And she was saying that one of the most effective ways historically to tamp down resistance has been to make people feel like there is nothing to be hopeful about, nothing to be joyful about. And that can lead to these just deep feelings of nihilism, or like, why would I fight against oppression? Because what am I fighting for? And so in kind of insisting on joy and insisting on the ability to feel joy and to share joy, you are also continually reminding yourself of the importance of building a better society and why it matters to you and to other people. And I just thought that was such a helpful framework for how these things are connected.
I know I also wanted to ask you if you feel like there's one moment or one story, one example that comes to mind where you embodied Esther, where you were in the right place at the right time and needed to step up to lead, and you did.
I am a very shy person. I'm a very fearful person in a lot of ways. And so it always feels really hard to me to be a leader and to say something or to go against the grain in any way. And so I feel like that's like one of the great continual challenges of my life. I do think this is not a time that I've embodied Esther, but one of the reasons that Purim is one of my favorite holidays is because of the invitation to sort of see the world as upside down and just completely invert your ways of thinking and acting and believing. So that's something I take very seriously every year. It's just trying to use that time to do things I would normally not do and say things I would normally not say, and kind of take on the mindset, like, what if I were wrong about everything I believed in? And how can that kind of shake me out of a sense of complacency or a sense of routine and see the world with completely fresh eyes?
I'm your host, Rabbi Liz Hirsch, CEO of Women of Reform Judaism, and you've been listening to Just for This. Check us out on most social media platforms at Just for This Podcast. You can also follow Women of Reform Judaism at WRJ1913. Our show is produced by Shear and Shim LLC. Special thanks to Allie Rubin, Izzy Wellman, the whole WRJ team, Rabbi Neil Hirsch, Lior, and Micah. Jen King designed our logo, and Eric Shimalonis wrote our theme music. Thanks for listening. We'll have more Just for This moments next time.